University, and interestingly, a BS in music performance from Welch College. And so he's a man who's got his feet dipped in a few different waters here. He's currently pursuing a PhD in history at Kansas State University, and he's co-authored 2 books, Light and Truth, a 75-year pictorial history of Welch College, where he and Dr. Pinson worked on that project together, and a history of the Cumberland Association, celebrating 175 years of leadership, ministry, and service, and he did that with Roy Harris. He and his wife, Megan, have 5 wonderful children, and I've gotten to meet those children, and they speak a lot of Phillip. He loves his children. One thing I love about Phillip too is he loves to farm, and he values the agrarian side that is really lost in many ways in our industrial age. And so I'm sure if you talk to him afterwards about that, he would love more to talk about that. Phillip, would you come?
It's an honor to be with you. The last time I read a paper for the Symposium, it was here 6 years ago in 2019. I'm going to be reading the paper John R. Gower and the Culture of Turn-of-the-Century Free Will Baptists. Just a quick kind of introductory word. This paper is going to be primarily historical rather than theological, although it bears upon our theology and our practices and some of the changes in our movement over time. I will highlight 2 things for you. I don't normally begin with a footnote, but in this case, I think it might be helpful. The first footnote that you have there explains that in my chapter of the Festschrift for Robert E. Piccirilli that I and Matthew Bracey published last year, I offer a summary of and critical engagement with Dr. Piccirilli's important work in Free Will Baptist history, where I particularly extol his efforts in gathering and organizing the records of the Free Will Baptist Historical Collection, but I also praise his detailed research into unfamiliar or previously untouched areas of our tradition's history. At the end of that chapter, I urged future historians to build on Piccirilli's work by more fully incorporating into our historical analysis the cultural and political context of our movement. And so this paper is an attempt, a modest attempt, to begin that process and to encourage further research along these lines. And then another note, this is methodological. This paper is an accident to some degree. I stumbled across this summer while I was looking for research for my church's history. We're celebrating our 145th anniversary this upcoming Sunday. And so a lot of the research that I did on this figure, John R. Gower, came out of newspapers that have been scanned and put online at newspapers.com. Dr. Piccirilli had mentioned this to me as an important venue for us to find new research years ago, but I hadn't really realized that until this year. So hopefully that'll be an encouragement to future historians also to really mine that resource. All right, now let's begin here of the first paragraph. Much of the history of Free Will Baptist in the 19th century is limited to analyzing the events that occurred within the movement, but fails to connect the hopes, dreams, pursuits, and fears of the men and women of our movement fully to the broader cultural and political context. In this essay, I provide some context to the culture of Free Will Baptist at the turn of the 20th century by considering the life of John R. Gower, a farmer, social leader, politician, and Free Will Baptist minister active in the Cumberland Association in Middle Tennessee from the 1870s to the 1920s. The particularities of his life, interests, and activities offer new insights into the world of Free Will Baptist at the turn of the 20th century. This social and cultural information also helps us to better understand the temperance and unity movements among Free Will Baptists during this time. Lastly, this essay aims to call our attention to the interplay between culture and theology, highlighting examples of cultural influence on our beliefs and practices. John Robert Gower was born in Robertson County, Tennessee in 1844 to a notable Free Will Baptist family. His father, James, was a prominent Free Will Baptist minister in the area and the son of Wilson L. Gower. On his mother's side, John Gower was the grandnephew of George Head. Wilson Gower and George Head were key participants in the founding of the Cumberland Association of Free Will Baptists in 1843. John Gower was educated in the local rural schools of Robertson County and quickly became a successful tobacco farmer and dealer in the Thomasville area on the border of Cheatham County, Robertson County, and Montgomery County. Though John would have been 16 when conflict broke out, he does not seem to have fought in the war between the states. However, he did marry during those tumultuous years, wedding his lifelong neighbor, Martha Woodruff, in late 1863. A little over 20 years later, after making a record tobacco trade deal, he purchased 365 acres of excellent farmland in Port Royal, that'd be in Tennessee, from Colonel William Weatherford for $10,000. The farm lay in a bend of the Red River and gave him ready access to the river port from which the town derived its name, and remains some of the most fertile soil in that part of the state of Tennessee. His father was a farmer and Free Will Baptist minister who pastored at least the Good Springs and Heads churches, probably others as well. Prior to the 20th century, most rural Free Will Baptist churches met only once per month and were pastored by local farmers whose call to preach had been confirmed by the local congregation. Like other rural Baptists in the South, when multiple men from the same congregation were ordained, they often struck out to found new churches in the area. And perhaps Gower's father, James, was part of that process because the number of Free Will Baptist churches in the area expanded significantly over the mid-19th century. As a result of these circumstances, preachers often oversaw multiple churches without clearly articulated terms of service. John Gower was an active layman in the association for many years before he was ordained as a minister in 1890, when he was 46 years of age. He reported as a delegate from Heads and Good Springs to the Cumberland Association multiple times, serving on the missionary board regularly. In 1879, Gower, who also had other responsibilities, was appointed by the association to write a history of their organization, a task that was eventually taken up by Brother G.V. Frey and published in 1911. He was also an early advocate for temperance and encouraged the Cumberland to join efforts toward regional associations with Baptists holding similar doctrinal commitments in the South. Gower's service on the missionary board for the Eastern Division of the Cumberland in the late 1870s, while he was still living in the Thomasville area, no doubt influenced his decision to gather a church near his new home in Port Royal after he moved in the mid-1880s. Soon after relocating, Gower began working with W.H. Bigger, J.F. Lockhart, and S.B. Nichols to gather Olivet Free Will Baptist Church, planning to build a meeting house near Lockhart's schoolhouse. The men not only pooled their considerable resources for this effort, but also looked for financial support from their community with the goal of sharing the meeting house with other denominations on a weekly rotating basis. By 1890, Olivet Church was reporting 25 members to the Cumberland Association and continues to meet in the same white clapboard frame building in 2025 with some modern renovations and expansion. Now, just say if you're ever in the Middle Tennessee area, I recommend you go and visit this church. It's beautiful, and they still have the original pulpit that has hand-carved olive leaves on it. It's a wonderful and beautiful church meeting house. And I think it may be the oldest meeting house in Middle Tennessee still in use for Free Will Baptist. Gower remained a widely respected tobacco and vegetable farmer in the area throughout his life. He was regularly listed among the most substantial tobacco dealers in Montgomery County by the Leaf Chronicle weekly newspaper out of Clarksville, Tennessee, and consistently competed for the highest price per hogshead of tobacco. Even during droughts, he seemed to produce better crops than most, likely from making good use of the nearby river for irrigation. Like many other Southern farmers at the end of the 19th century, Gower actively participated in cooperative associations in order to strengthen the economic might of individual farmers. Gower and his wife, Martha, became part of at least 2 agricultural cooperatives during the late 19th century. The Planters Protective Association provided a means for tobacco farmers to pool their resources to contend for higher and more regular prices for their crops. But the Gowers were also interested in diversifying their crops, and John served as the first president of the Red River Truck Growing Association, which was formed to help local farmers build commercial connections with canning companies for tomatoes and corn. Both of these organizations were part of the larger cooperative movement among farmers that began in the 1890s with the goal of combining the economic power of individual farmers to compete more fairly against the trust and corporations that bought their crops in regional, national, and global markets. These cooperative organizations also provided education for farmers, focusing on ways to modernize their practices and make their farms more efficient so that they could successfully work together to standardize production, centralize distribution and marketing, and set prices. Furthermore, as historian Charles Postal explains, farm reformers saw these cooperatives as only one piece of a larger social transformation, where cooperation would be carried into every department of human life to its fullest extent. In the end, the farm reformers believed that applying cooperative business principles was an essential part of a more rational, dynamic, and modern path of development. Those are key characteristics that we want to kind of hold on to, as well as the idea of efficiency as we go through this paper. Gower's active participation in farmers' cooperatives suggests that he was inclined to see collective social action as a means of transforming society by using the power and influence of the group to make society more efficient, standardized, and centralized, but only along lines that conformed with his deeply held religious beliefs. Gower's leadership in the church and farmers' cooperatives was only part of the reason he was considered a very active, clever, and highly esteemed citizen in his community. He was also active politically. For many years, he served as a judge over local elections, monitoring the polls for irregularities. He even served in this capacity for the Democratic Party's primary elections and was regarded as a staunch member of the party in the community. Now, just to note, the Democratic Party of the late 19th century was significantly different from the party of the 21st century. From its founding in 1828 under the leadership of Andrew Jackson until the early 20th century, the Democratic Party was largely the political party of rural America, opposing the centralization of government in Washington, D.C., and the industrialization of the American economy. The Democratic Party was particularly incensed by the use of federal tariffs that protected American industries while significantly harming farmers who sold their crops to other countries and imported most of their manufactured goods. They considered tariffs a means of redistributing wealth from the countryside to the urban centers. The party had been strongest in the South prior to the war between the states, though there were also many Democrats in northern states, especially New York, before the war. While the Republican Party, founded in 1854, dominated federal and state political power in the North during the war and the South during Reconstruction, the Democratic Party began to recover during the 1870s, slowly retaking control of Southern legislatures, governors' mansions, and representation in Congress. However, the party's policy commitments and constituency were also beginning to shift in important ways, and this is exactly the time period we're looking at. During Gower's years of political activity in the last 2 decades of the 19th century and the first decade of the 20th, populists like William Jennings Bryan significantly influenced the Democratic Party, advocating for increased democratization of the federal government so that Washington, D.C. might be harnessed to achieve the goals of rural America. More specifically, they sought to use the federal government to achieve currency reform, increase rural education, enfranchise women, pass temperance legislation, adopt direct election of senators, and pass a federal progressive income tax. Populists' variegated social reform commitments were deeply intertwined, with each policy impinging upon and buttressing the others in the pursuit of Southern rural interests and moral reform of society. After these policy goals were largely achieved during the 1910s, the Democratic Party began shifting toward progressive leftism, which had some overlap with populist concerns, and became the party we know today. While the populist movement included some black voters and was not ideologically tied to segregation in the same way the progressives were, many white populists nonetheless worked to end black suffrage and pursued white governance in local, state, and federal government because black voters were almost universally Republican until the 1910s. For some populists, segregation was merely a continuation of informal prejudices, but for many others, it was an attempt to be modern and scientific according to the standards of the day. Still, segregation was not the dominant goal in populist politics. The heart of the populist movement was the pursuit of social reform toward the values and interests of fervently religious rural communities. The available sources suggest that Gower's political activity focused on rural education and temperance. He had an abiding interest in education and was a strong advocate for using the power of the state to eliminate the production, sale, and consumption of alcohol. For the purposes of this paper, I will not be engaging his multiple elections to the school board in his district, but his commitment to education may have led the Cumberland Association to elect him to serve on the Literature and Union Committee of 1890 and task him with writing the history of the association. The temperance movement began in New England and areas receiving heavy New England immigration, like upstate New York and Ohio, in the mid-1810s. The reformers were motivated by fears surrounding the War of 1812, a marked rise in alcohol consumption flowing from the dropping price of whiskey, and the precipitous decline of the Federalist political party outside of New England. Those may not seem as interrelated, and I don't get into this here, but you can go into the footnotes and go to those sources, and those are all deeply connected to each other. Federalist religious leaders like Lyman Beecher began pursuing legislative action to achieve social moral reform. Marxist historian Paul E. Johnson argues that the standardization of work habits and the separation of factory owners from their employees in the process of industrialization significantly contributed to building support for temperance among the respectable urban middle class and only later the working class as they sought to rise socially. However, Johnson's interpretation fails to adequately account for the multiplicity of motivations for temperance advocates or explain the persuasiveness of the movement's millenarian aspirations. Robert H. Abzug maintains that temperance spread beyond the ranks of Northeast elites when the religious fervor and postmillennialism of the revivals of the 1830s were coupled with modern scientific statistics about the effects of alcohol consumption of all sorts. According to revivalists like Charles Grandison Finney and Timothy Dwight Weld, who extolled the Northern Free Will Baptists for their early fervor in the temperance cause, the will of man was free to choose between good and evil without the empowerment of the Holy Spirit. They called upon their audience to will into existence a coming utopia founded on temperance, among other reforms. If alcohol consumption were allowed to continue, the revivalists and reformers claimed that statistical evidence showed a future of assured national destruction. In the feverish cause for saving the nation and bringing on the millennium, reformers externalized the causes of sin to the bottle, making alcohol the cause of all manner of wickedness in society, rather than the sinfulness of man working its way out through drunkenness. Further, individual and social salvation came through signing the temperance pledge of a local temperance society and harnessing the power of individual will rather than faith in Jesus and engagement with the ordinary means of grace. For these reasons, many conservative religious leaders, especially among low church Protestants and Southerners, they opposed the temperance movement prior to the Civil War. Southerners who embraced temperance in the late 19th century tended to be evangelical populists who argued that alcohol consumption's links to crime and dishonorable activities like gambling, horse racing, and fighting made it a blight on society. The Southern cultural emphasis on local, limited government meant that most Southern temperance advocates were moderates and tended to favor private solutions or local bans on the sale of alcohol rather than statewide programs until the populist movement emerged with its emphasis on social reform through legislation. Radical prohibitionist organizations founded and headquartered in the Northeast, like the Independent Order of Good Templars and Women's Christian Temperance Union, eschewed individual moral suasion and local solutions, calling instead for statewide legislation. For this reason, most late 19th century Southerners associated radical temperance with carpetbaggers, Northern social reformers who sought to modernize and remake the states of the former Confederacy in New England's image. The Farmers Alliance, one of the largest populist agricultural cooperations, took up temperance reform as a central policy concern in the 1890s and made the issue much more palatable to Southern farmers who were distrustful of Northern culture and interests. While the temperance movement garnered limited interest in Tennessee as early as the 1830s, broader support accrued over the next 50 years. The issue rose to prominence in the mid-1880s when the state legislature proposed a constitutional amendment to ban the sale and manufacture of intoxicants within the state of Tennessee. And though the proposed amendment was voted down by the public in 1887, local towns across the state individually voted to go dry over the next 20 years until the state legislature passed a prohibition bill over the veto of the governor in 1909. While the Randall Free Will Baptists of the North, predominantly middle class and rooted in New England pietism, adopted temperance as early as the 1820s and radical temperance by the 1840s, among Southern Free Will Baptists, there were very few advocates for temperance reforms until the end of the 19th century. The existing records suggest that most associations began making temperance resolutions and forming temperance committees to head up their efforts in the 1880s and 1890s, with a few outliers addressing the issue as early as the 1870s or as late as the 1900s. And this shift parallels the rise of temperance interest in the South more broadly. The first recorded resolution advocating temperance in the Cumberland Association was adopted in 1876, making it one of the first associations to hold this position among Free Will Baptists in the South. The earliest known statements on temperance in the Cumberland Association were adopted as resolutions in 1876, 1878, 1879, and 1880. Each year, the same resolution against the sale, manufacture, and use of intoxicating liquors as a beverage was adopted because it was unbecoming a Christian and unsafe in a community. The ministers of the association were encouraged to use their influence to prevent either. These resolutions hold to a relatively moderate view on temperance, considering the consumption of alcohol for the purposes of a beverage as a mark against the Christian's reputation, and calling upon ministers to use their personal influence toward moral suasion against the use of alcohol as a beverage. Medicinal uses were not addressed, and there were no calls for litigation against the sale, manufacture, or use of intoxicating liquors. The minutes of the Cumberland for these years recommend Northern Free Will Baptist literature and periodicals to its members as consistent with their beliefs, which would suggest that they might have been drawing from that influence in regard to temperance. However, the moderation of the Cumberland statement does not comport with the radical stance of the Randall movement taken decades earlier. In addition, the Cumberland Association's focus on the topic of temperance seems to have wavered in the mid-1880s, suggesting that it had not yet become a major issue for them. Now, part of our problem is that we don't have all the minutes from this time period. So the minutes for 1881 to 1883 and 1887 to 1889 have not yet been recovered. However, no resolution regarding temperance was offered for the years 1884 through 1886 or 1890, the year that John Gower was ordained. Though John Gower does not have a direct connection to the Cumberland Association's early statements on temperance, I do think it's instructive to note that he was actively involved in committee service and missions work in the association each of the years that the temperance resolution was taken up, except for 1880. In the years that lack any resolution, he is not listed as participating in the meeting. Further, while the association's attention to temperance seems to have waned during the 1880s, Gower's clearly did not. In late July 1886, he opened his property to the local community groups committed to temperance for a big barbecue, hosted by the local chapters of the Independent Order of Good Templars and Women's Christian Temperance Union. Hundreds of people came to eat, fellowship, share experiences of liberation from drink, and hear speeches on temperance. A decade after Gower allowed his land to be used for this gathering, the adherents to the movement were still, quote, not numerous, end quote, in Montgomery County, according to the local paper. However, the radical temperance movement was helped along by the rise of populism and the Farmers Alliance and the development of a method for bottling and preserving unfermented grape juice that could replace wine during communion services. Therefore, it seems that Gower embraced radical temperance rather early in comparison to his neighbors and promoted active government action for social reform along these lines. While his commitment to temperance was not strong enough to draw him away from the Democratic Party to join the Prohibition Party that ran candidates in the state of Tennessee from 1872 to 1896, his commitment to temperance likely played an important role in pushing the Cumberland Association into a more ardent position on temperance. The first recorded formation of a temperance committee in the Cumberland Association was in 1894. As a committee, ministers George W. Binkley and J. Ernest Curtis and layman J. M. Walker proposed a two-part resolution that called upon the association, in common with other Christian organizations, to recommend temperance for the individual, and we as a church use our influence for the promotion of the temperance cause. Further, they recommended that all ministers of this association give special attention to its evils, and that an unceasing effort be made by them to impress these truths upon their hearers. This moderate temperance statement continued to place the burden for temperate living on the individual morally persuaded to the rightness of the cause by the preaching of faithful ministers. In addition, a key motivation for pursuing this action was the opportunity to work in common with other Christian organizations. In the Nashville area, Baptists, Methodists, and Presbyterians were actively pursuing temperance and held a large conference in 1896 to plan a renewed fight against alcohol. It seems the renewed temperance vigor in the Cumberland had some connections to this broader trend, but Gower's more radical temperance association suggests that he would not have been satisfied with the moderation of the 1894 statement. In 1895, the Temperance Committee, consisting of ministers William Roberts and J. Ernest Curtis and layman B. Morrell, issued a much more strident resolution that still adhered to individual responsibility and moral suasion. However, they issued a demand to every member of this entire association that temperance in all its phases be embraced. Ministers were called upon to preach against the evils of the use of alcohol in any of its forms, including for medicinal purposes or communion. Alcohol, in itself, was condemned for having a damning influence and demoralizing effects on the human race. So this statement adopted the externalization of the evil of drinking to alcohol itself in all its forms, whether distilled or fermented. The first resolution in the existing records calling for legal action in the cause of temperance was issued by the Temperance Committee of 1896, which included H.T. Winters from John Gower's Church, Olivet. And this next sentence begins with a factual error. Sorry, this is from an earlier draft. This is not the first Temperance Committee. That was actually in 1894. So I'm going to skip ahead to about halfway through that sentence. This resolution committee issued a resolution that stated the battle against intemperance should dominate this association in its Christian labors because drunkenness is condemned by God's word, which teaches that no drunkard shall inherit the kingdom of heaven. The resolution further held that temperance is one of the fundamental and principal doctrines of the Christian life that determines our access to God's blessings. Lastly, the association had a duty to address the social disorder attending intemperance, especially since intemperance is the most potent influence of our day to lead young men astray. Therefore, they resolved to denounce the liquor traffic in all its forms, and that we use all our influence to have this evil blotted from Tennessee's state statutes forever, and that no member of be retained in our churches who uses intoxicating liquors as a beverage. The 1896 resolution expanded significantly on the association's previous statements in favor of temperance. The members of the association had shifted from viewing the drinking of intoxicating liquors as unbecoming a Christian's reputation and unsafe in the community to risking eternal damnation. Further, rather than calling upon ministers to preach against intemperance and urging all individuals to practice self-control, they now called upon the state to eliminate the entire liquor traffic in order to preserve social order. Lastly, the expectations for the members of the Cumberland Association congregation shifted significantly. Whereas previous resolutions warned against intemperance, the 1896 resolution called for anyone who drank intoxicating liquors as a beverage to be excommunicated from the congregation. However, the debate does not seem to have been completely resolved, as the Cumberland Association Temperance Committee noted in 1908. In fact, the discussion within the Cumberland seems to have continued for the remainder of the 19th century. In 1897, the Temperance Committee's resolution called for ministers to advocate for and practice total abstinence from intoxicants because intemperance is a curse to any nation, but it did not call for state or local legislation. In 1899, the resolution was expanded to oppose fermented drinks in addition to distilled liquors. Then, beginning in 1900, the Cumberland Association's position seems to have solidified in support of state legislation banning all sale, manufacture, and consumption of alcohol in any form. By this time, prohibition legislation had been passed in many southern local governments and was under consideration at the state level. The preceding historical analysis reveals the importance of considering the influence of historical circumstance and culture on theology. Our theology never develops in a vacuum. We are not merely brains and vats disconnected from the rest of creation. Culture is a part of God's general revelation that informs our understanding and application of the Bible to our lives. That is not to say that biblical and theological arguments are nothing more than cultural. That's what the secularists would argue. The truths that Scripture give are universal and eternal. However, we err if we assume that our theological commitments are completely divorced from the particulars of circumstance. As we refine and flesh out our theology, we must attend to the philosophical and cultural forces at play. In some circumstances, we may find that the cultural moment affirms scriptural principles and situate our particular theological application of those principles in agreement with the culture. In other circumstances, when a culture advocates beliefs and practices that cannot be reconciled with our understanding of Scripture, we must recognize the difference and boldly proclaim the truth in spite of opposing social pressure. When considering unity movements, we see the Cumberland Association taking a more cautious stance toward the culture's influence. The desire to build cooperative institutions and political movements was not confined to society and politics. During the last half of the 19th century, a rising tide of unity movements swamped nearly every American Protestant denomination and led the Northern Free Will Baptist into merging with the Northern Baptist in 1911. Those who advocated for unity were inclined toward ecumenicalism and harnessing the power of numbers. In fact, they had much in common with the cooperativists and populists, though that has often been overlooked. During the late 19th century, most Protestant denominations in America, under the influence of the Enlightenment and the rise of Pietism, embraced varying levels of ecumenism. Denominations everywhere were looking to build stronger institutional organizations within and bridges with like-minded groups without. As Robert L. Vaughn and Robert E. Piccirilli have shown, Southern Free Will Baptists were not immune to the unity movements. Vaughn and Piccirilli specifically focused their attention on the competing unity movements of the late 19th century, led by Bushrod W. Nash in North Carolina and Alvin D. Williams in Tennessee. Nash, who was from the Union Baptist movement in Virginia, sought to build a Southern Baptist Association, not to be confused with the Southern Baptist Convention, but the Southern Baptist Association consisting of all Baptist churches that held to free grace, free agency, and free communion. Nash had some success among Free Will Baptists in Alabama, Georgia, and North and South Carolinas, beginning as early as the 1850s, but failed to achieve fully his goals because many Free Will Baptists were rightly concerned about losing their distinct identity. Williams was a Randall Movement Free Will Baptist from Pennsylvania. After 4 decades of pastoring numerous churches across the Randall Movement, he moved to Kennesaw, Nebraska in 1872, or maybe it's 1873, we're not real sure, and he was the first pioneer family in the area. He was active among Nebraska Free Will Baptists before he decided to move to Nashville, Tennessee in 1889. He seems to have moved to Middle Tennessee with the express goal of building a unity movement among Southern Free Will Baptists and other white liberal Baptists, by which he meant those holding to the freedom of the will, universal atonement, and other Arminian teachings about soteriology, as well as to open communion. While his precise motives are unclear, he saw some success in building connections between Free Will Baptist associations from Alabama, Arkansas, Georgia, Tennessee, Texas, and Virginia. He seems to have been received well in Nashville, serving as the moderator for the Cumberland Association in 1890, before he gave up the unity effort and moved on to Indiana in 1891, where he worked amongst the General Baptist for a while. This is all the more impressive because, according to Williams, the Southern Free Will Baptists opposed any further aid from Northern men than may be asked for and rendered consistently with the ideas and feelings of the Southern Brethren. So Southern Free Will Baptists were leery of Northern help and perceived real differences between their doctrines and those of Northern Free Will Baptists. However, John Gower seems to have had a special affinity for Williams and his work. Along with Williams, Gower and Brother J.E. Hudgens from Ashland City were elected to serve as delegates from the Cumberland Association to the General Association meeting in Hartselle, Alabama in December 1890. The 1890 report of the Cumberland Literature and Union Committee, which was filled by Gower with 2 other laymen and 2 ministers, praised God for increased interest in the uniting of all white liberal Baptists of the South. The Literature and Union Committee also recommended supporting the Herald and Enterprise periodical edited by Williams and used to promote the Southern Unification movement. The Herald and Enterprise took out an advertisement on the back page of the 1890 Cumberland Minutes, highlighting that the one unity organization of the General Association would add greatly to the efficiency, strength, and prosperity of white liberal Baptists. The desire to promote a more efficient and robust movement through cooperative organizations fits well with the ideals and motivations of the populist movement, made up of deeply religious Southern farmers who sought to use social and political action to give power and influence to their values. While the people of the Cumberland Association at the turn of the 20th century were certainly influenced by the prejudices and cultural norms of their day, the explicit designation of this unity movement as for whites is likely more descriptive for descriptive purposes than prescriptive. We know that there's some of that being used in the Randall movement as well, and so we think that that's at least descriptive rather than prescriptive. Vaughan and Pickerley also have good reason to suggest that the General Association's firm messaging about being for whites was at least partially motivated by Nash's attempts in North Carolina to undermine Williams by accusing him of being an advocate of racial mixing in society. And Williams had indeed worked with black Free Will Baptists in the past. However, this emphasis may suggest that populist support for segregation had influenced Southern Free Will Baptists at the time. Neither Nash nor Williams was ultimately successful in building a lasting unity movement. Though the reasons for their failure are not altogether clear, many who were most interested in Nash's overall mission seem to have joined the Disciples of Christ as a clearer articulation of their doctrinal commitments. On the other side, both Nash and Williams's unification programs required Free Will Baptists to reduce their doctrinal non-negotiables too far for comfort. Their movements also seem to have been dominated by their individual personalities. So after Williams moved to Indiana and after Nash died, their unity movements lost steam and quickly dissipated. Also, the logistics of travel and communication in the South prior to the mid-20th century made the prospects of building a regional association of farmers and farmer preachers much more unlikely. John R. Gower's life provides a fascinating insight into the culture and interests of Free Will Baptists at the turn of the 20th century. His background in farming cooperatives, the temperance movement, and democratic politics offers more nuance to our understanding of the association's stance on alcohol and the motivations of those who were inclined toward unification programs. The broader cultural forces of the day significantly influenced the beliefs and practices of the Cumberland Association and Free Will Baptists throughout the South. However, that influence was not determinative. The clerical and lay leaders of congregations and associations worked through tensions between their understanding of the Bible and its application in their lives. The same holds true in the present. As we wrestle with the principalities and powers of our age, we need to take stock of how the culture is shaping and influencing our assumptions and patterns of thought. Let us be wise as serpents in our labor.
Well, thank you, Mr. Morgan. At this time, if we have any questions, please raise your hand.
Excellent work, Mr. Morgan. I wanted to ask you to, your two topics are temperance or social reform and unity movements. So how does Gower's story help us understand the contrast between the northern movement and the southern movement among Free Will Baptists, the Free Baptists of the North and the Free Will Baptists of the South? Okay. Yes, so you've got the Northern Free Baptists and the Free Will Baptists of the South, and so you've got this kind of social reform, pietism, and revivalism thrust, and then you've got the ecumenism. So how does that Southern Free Will Baptist unity movement compare and contrast with the ecumenism that the Northern Free Baptists fell into? And how does the social reform efforts and social gospel and the like compare and contrast between the two movements, and how is Gower an illustration of that?
How does he serve as a good illustration? So I think one of the things that I was struck by as I was doing research on Gower was how complex that relationship is, and maybe more complex than I had given credit to in the past. in that Gower he's a farmer. He's from a farming family, a very prominent Free Will Baptist family in Middle Tennessee. I kind of tried to make that clear by who his ancestors are, his forefathers. So he's clearly from that background, that movement, but he's also very educated, very learned, and he's interested in social reform and cooperative organizations to harness the power of rural America. However, he has limits to how far he's willing to abide those changes. And so in the Randall movement, the ecumenicalism and the pietism is stronger, it seems to me, in the influence of their thinking. And so they are more willing to sacrifice things to try to build these unity movements. And I think that comes to their connections with New England and New England pietism coming out of the Enlightenment and then the First and Second Great Awakenings. And the Gower's experience is that they're interested in those things, especially educated Southerners, which he seems to have been pretty highly educated. All his kids seem to have been pretty highly educated that we can find in the records. He is interested in literature. He's interested in cooperative associations. And so all of that seems to fit with what his interests are. But when it comes to the temperance movement and social reform, he finds that meshes fine with his theology and his understanding of the Bible and how it applies. When it came to the unity movements, he was, again, very much in favor of attempting to do that, but those attempts don't really play out. And so I think that you find amongst Free Will Baptists in the South, there was a concerted interest in unity movements, and maybe he's even on kind of the extreme end of that, because he's part of that association or that committee that's going to represent the Cumberland at the General Assembly or the General Association. He's going to represent them, but there's also limits to how much people are willing to unite. And if they're going to have to give up their distinctives, and so you can't boil down Free Will Baptist doctrine to free communion, free will, and just boil it down to bland Arminianism and free communion. And I think that's where they got cold feet on that and backed out. But I think that's why the unity movement in 1935 is more successful, is because they're not having to sacrifice these non-negotiables. They're still having to reconcile some differences, but they aren't of the same sort.
I have another question.
Okay, I don't want to ask this as a leading question, but for lack of creativity, I probably will. I'm assuming, again, that the Southern Free Will Baptists were slower in adopting the temperance movement or getting in on that because of its sort of evil by association dynamic with abolitionists of the North and suffragist movement as well. That was kind of their trio issues there in the North. Is that fair to say, or?
I think, well, part of it is just historically, geographically, the temperance movement begins in New England, so it just doesn't reach the South nearly as early. And then when it does reach the South, it comes with all of that attending kind of cultural baggage from the North. And I think that's why so you do have some people who are advocating for temperance in the South pretty early, but they are going to tend to be more moderate Whig politically, which would have been in a line with New England, if that makes sense. But getting that broad-based support, it kind of has to wait until the end of the 19th century because of, it's so hard, I think, for us to remember how conflicted those mid-decades of the 19th century were, that Southerners really wanted nothing to do with Northerners in many ways. And so that made it very difficult for it to gain any traction until the 1880s, 1890s.
Okay.
Getting my exercise here.
I'll just take this maybe a little different direction. Okay. Oh, my bad. Pastoring a church that's been around for 100 years. I'm the clerk of our district that's been around for 100 years. I have read through some of our minutes. and it's amazing how many resolutions and decisions were made, and you have no clue why they were made. I'm assuming you probably ran into that in all of the research that you did for your paper. And I know you kind of addressed it at the beginning of your paper. Are you suggesting that in our minutes keeping that there is some sort of record keeping of what's going on culturally that made those decisions important, if that makes sense? Why decisions were made, because a lot of times it did have something to do with the culture rather than just what was going on. If that makes sense.
That's an excellent question. My wife is the clerk of the Cumberland now, and has been the clerk of the Northern Quarterly for, I don't know, probably 15 years at this point. And I am the curator for the historical collection, so I see a lot of minutes. And by the way, and I'm not saying this is you, but if you're a clerk today, take good minutes. Because you would be shocked. Some of the minutes that I get in, it is practically nothing there. And you may think nobody's going to care. People will care. And it is helpful for us to understand what you're doing. Now, to your cultural context, actually, that's absolutely almost never there in the minutes. It is really, really helpful when somebody passes a very robust resolution that makes those connections explicit. In this case, that is almost never present. What I'm actually suggesting, and this is kind of where I'm bringing kind of my background and what I would encourage our Free Will Baptist historians going forward is, you have to do the legwork of studying what's going on in the culture in the time period and be specific. So I've read in my graduate studies lots about 19th century American history, and the reform movements have come up, and my dissertation kind of impinges on that to some degree. But I had to do some really specific digging into Middle Tennessee, because I didn't know that. And so, but that helps us, I think, to understand, because what we can say is, for sure, these people are not ignorant of the things going on in their world. And that was brought home to me through my scanning of the newspapers on newspapers.com, because everybody has been shocked by I say everybody. When I subject people to what I'm telling them about what I found in my research, they act like they're shocked, to be nice. At what all they're publishing in the newspapers, because they're like, well, the newspapers today, they print nothing of really much worth. And they're like, oh, they just have all kinds of stuff. It could be there was a wild dog in town today. And they're widely read because they don't have Facebook or social media of any sort, or even evening news. And so that, I think, helps us to get that cultural context. And that's where I found all this biographical stuff on John R. Gower. And it was fascinating how much was there. Now, he got a lot of attention because he was influential, politically active, and he came and buddied up to the newspaper editor. That was pretty clear. So, yeah, I think that's how I would say, that's where I'm getting that cultural context. But I think we can, without any kind of stretch of the imagination, say, obviously their culture is shaping what they're doing. When we take up resolutions on abortion in my association, I mean, part of that has been related to the abortion fight for the last decades. So.
Any other questions? We still have a few more minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Morgan. I appreciate that paper. Could you speak to the way in which it feels as if the early Southern temperance movement is driven in large part by the emphasis of revivalism and the way in which the revivalist tradition focused on moral suasion? Mm-hmm. That seemed to be an interesting component to your research. Yeah. And I think it speaks to the power of our focus in our churches on preaching the Word of God and sharing that and calling for a response, calling for repentance, and the way in which that can impact the culture. So.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. So, and by the way, again, if you have minutes, I would love for you to send them to the historical collection because we're missing a lot. And this actually is pertinent to your question specifically because Dr. Davidson, Bill Davidson, in his history, he cites minutes from the Mount Moriah Association that have been lost. They were never in our collection. They were in private holdings. And I won't go through all of the details, but those have just been lost. Well, in that minutes, it says that they essentially brought a guy up on charges for drunkenness, and they dealt with it. And it's pretty detailed from what Dr. Davidson reports. So they're dealing with that in the 1850s. It's not like all of a sudden they become concerned about drunkenness in the 1870s. That probably, from what we would know about our beliefs in the Bible and what we see in that particular instance, they're preaching against drunkenness and trying to hold people accountable in the same way that we call all of our congregants to obey the word of the Lord. It starts to take on the, and so when we see it in the temperance resolutions in the Cumberland specifically, there's still that emphasis on personal responsibility and the preacher's duty to preach the word of God faithfully and to hold their congregants accountable. So call the congregants to obey the word of the Lord and persuade them lovingly and consistently. Then it begins to shift towards a more social reform idea. In roughly the 1890s is where that shift begins to happen, which would parallel the rise of the populist movement. I think we could all agree that we want to pursue legislation that encourages and promotes righteousness and punishes wickedness. However, I think one of the dangers that, at least it seems to me, occurs here is that Christians began to offload all of that responsibility to the state. And now it's the state's responsibility. And if you eliminate this material thing, we'll solve the sin problem. That's explicit in Charles Grandison Finney's teachings and in the Northern Reformers. It is not explicit in the Southerners that I can tell, but you can hear echoes of it, especially as you get further into the 20th century, which I didn't really deal with. It becomes much more explicit. And so, I'm not saying that it was wrong for them to pursue the legislation, but you can't pursue the legislation and then also let go of the idea of you have to learn to be temperate in your life. And that's beyond, drunkenness, but be moderate in your use of food and moderate in your use of media and all those things.
Still have about 3 minutes. I see no hands going up. All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Morgan. Could we please give him a hand? And looking at our schedule, we will break until chapel at 10:45. Dr. Pinson is preaching in chapel, and then after that is lunch. We will reconvene. Daniel Mann he'll speak to us at 1 o'clock. Oh yes. If you are attending, you have not signed the sign-in sheet in the table out front, please do so. And if you'd like a copy of the papers, they are $20 for the printed, and then there's $8 for the digital. And so, is that right? Okay, I got it. Okay. Any other questions? Yes, sir. Yes. Chapel's in the big auditorium. So, all right. You are dismissed.